Welcome to China Focus. I'm Shelley Zhang. Well, the first quarter numbers are in for China's economy, and it isn't looking as good as some people had expected. The first quarter GDP growth number is at 7.7%. That's down from 7.9% at the end of last year, and below what many economists had predicted to be 8%. Now, what's up with the numbers? Here today to talk about this, we have Gordon Chang, Forbes columnist and author of The Coming Collapse of China. Gordon, so a lot of newspapers are saying that, the idea that GDP growth is slowing down shows China's recovery is losing steam. Do you agree with that?
Well, it certainly is, because, yeah, they talked about 7.7% growth, but they probably were down about 3%. You look at, there's a couple troubling set of statistics. One of them is electricity, which is by far the most reliable indicator of Chinese economic activity. For the quarter, electricity production increased by 2.9%. And because the growth of GDP is traditionally 85% of the growth of electricity, that means we're looking at an economy growing at about 2.6, 2.7%, maybe a little bit more. The other thing is producer price index. For January and February, producer prices were down 1.6%. And in March, they were down 1.9%. And because China is still primarily a manufacturing economy, we're looking at deflation in China. Well, how can you have robust growth of 7.7% and deflation at the same time? That just doesn't happen in our galaxy. So clearly, we are not at the high sevens. We don't know where we are, but we're probably somewhere in the 3s. And if the investment community knew that, then the stock market sell-off would have been much worse than it was.
So let's say that, we're in the 3s, like you said. The Chinese, National Bureau of Statistics is not going to say that they're in the 3s. So what does it mean that they're saying 7.7?
It means that they know that they've got a problem which is much bigger than they're willing to admit. Chinese leaders say, we're trying to readjust the economy, move it to a more sustainable basis, better quality growth, which is the phrase that they use. Well, that's not true, because just to get the growth that they have, they've been pouring more and more state money into construction. This is state investment. This is absolutely the wrong thing to do, because they're creating debt faster than their ability to service it. And they're taking China even further away from the only sustainable growth model, which is one based on consumption. So Chinese leaders are really in a bind, and they're not willing to admit it.
What does better quality growth even mean, if they were saying better quality growth?
In general, what they mean is not state investment. They're really referring to consumption, because everybody agrees that China needs more consumption. The United States is basically 70% of our GDP is consumption. Well, in 2011, it was 35% in China. And people say it went up a couple percentage points in 2012. I actually don't think that it did. But even if it did, China still is at the bottom end. There's no country where consumption plays a smaller role in the economy. And with all of this state investment that we've seen last year, and we've started to see again this year, well, we're even going below where we were before on consumption. This is really a problem for Chinese leaders, because they know what to do. They've been talking about increasing consumption for more than a half decade, but the Chinese economy is becoming more and more dependent on state investment.
Well, I want to talk about the state investment, because one of the things that economists were predicting 8%. If you use the official numbers as a base, 8% growth this quarter, one of the things they were saying, it should be 8% because of the massive amounts of credit that they're pushing, all the state infrastructure projects that you're talking about. So what does it mean that, even with all that spending, like you're saying, they're still reporting below 8%?
Well, what's happening here is that state investment is having less and less effect. And the reason is because they've pushed so much state money into this economy since the end of 2008. In 2009, they had, an incredible amount of stimulus, probably almost a couple $1 trillion in an economy then, which was about $4.3 trillion. So you had maybe, 1.2 trillion of stimulus in 2009. That's an incredible number. And because they've been doing this for so long, 2008, 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, the point is that it's now becoming ineffective. And so you're now having to put $7, $8 of investment to get $1 of GDP growth. Well, that's clearly unsustainable. And so that's why, economists can say, well, they should have had 8% growth. But clearly, when you look at what's going on right now, you can throw money into this economy, but you really can't produce the growth.
So a lot of, recently Fitch and Moody's have both kind of downgraded their outlook on China's economy, partly based on the idea that there's too much credit, there's too much credit, there's too much debt. Should we be worried about this?
Well, we should. And, in a sense, what Fitch did was it downgraded long-term local currency debt. And generally speaking, foreigners don't have renminbi-denominated debt. They just don't hold that. And then the foreign debt that China has is like $34 billion, which is nothing. Mm-hmm. So that debt will get paid back. No problem about it. China has the ability to do it.
So is it more about the other issues it brings to the economy?
Yeah. What happens is, the thing that we have to be concerned about, of course, is that the Chinese economy is going to fail pretty soon. You can see it. You just don't know when, but it has an end-of-cycle feel to it. And so therefore, you got to consider about what's going to happen, for instance, to people who are trying to sell stuff to China. You have to worry about foreign investment already in China. Actually, when you think about all this, it is going to be enormous effect on global markets. As we saw, on Monday when they announced this stuff, we had a real problem in this country in terms of the Dow falling more than 200 points. If we thought about it, though, we got to realize China should have less effect on the world, because China has, everyone says it's this engine of global growth. Well, that's not true, because to be an engine of global growth, you've got to take the imports from other countries to support growth elsewhere. Well, China subtracts growth from the rest of the world through its predatory manufacturing policies and trade policies. So, the Chinese economy could fold up and go home, and it would have much less effect on the world than we worry about. But nonetheless, the psychological impact is going to be enormous.
So when you say end of cycle, are you thinking this year sometime?
Could easily be this year, because you can see that they're putting all this money into the economy. They're having less and less effect. They're creating debt faster than their ability to service it. This is completely unsustainable. You have this construction boom, which I actually saw with my own eyes because I went back to my dad's hometown 3 weeks ago, which for hundreds of years was this dusty agricultural town. Now it looks like a little Manhattan with these skyscrapers, uncountable number of apartment blocks, an NFL-sized stadium, these wide boulevards densely packed with streetlights. So this was just in all 5 years. It was completely unrecognizable.
So
and the question is, no people.
I was going to say, was there a growth in the population?
No, of course not. And as one elderly resident said to my wife, where are they going to find all these people? And that's a problem because, China, the workforce already peaked in 2010, now is getting smaller. The country as a whole is going to peak probably before 2020. China's demographic trends are accelerating as country gets smaller and smaller. This is, the population growth. Everyone had assumed that China's population would peak sometime after 2030, maybe even after 2035. But now you have central government officials saying 2020, which really means 2018 or 2019. And these trends are just so stark as how fast China has changed.
So let me bring you to kind of a different topic here. Your recent Forbes column about what the biggest threat to China's economy is, and I was kind of surprised at what you said it was. You said it wasn't the debt issue.
Yeah, the thing that could really turn the lights out on China immediately is geopolitical turmoil. And North Asia right now is perhaps, I actually think it's the most volatile region on Earth. You have, of course, North Korea. What North Korea could do, God knows. And then, of course, you have China trying to take territory away from an arc of nations, from India in the south to South Korea in the north. Of course, the big problem is China and Japan over the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, what the Chinese call the Diaoyus. You have China trying to close off the South China Sea, which brings it into conflict with the United States. So a bust up there, and it could come from any number of places, could turn the Chinese economy off in a moment. And that's really a concern, because this is something that we've all been concerned about. We look at the debt, we look at adverse demography, we look at all of these internal factors, but we forget that the one thing that can have the biggest effect overnight is geopolitics.
Well, don't you think that Beijing is looking out for this?
The problem is that Beijing should be looking out for this, problem is Beijing should not be trying to cause friction with its neighbors. But the problem is China is trapped in this, what I call a feedback loop, because you've got a slumping economy is causing a crisis of legitimacy. The legitimacy crisis is causing Chinese leaders to fall back on nationalism and increase friction with other nations. And this increased friction is aggravating the economic difficulties. Because, for instance, in last September, you had the problems with Japan over the Senkaku's values. And then Japanese industry, was targeted by the Chinese. And so what did people in Japan do? Well, they started thinking about shifting their investments out of China into other parts of Asia, as Nissan announced in October with that big plant for Thailand, which people expected had to go into China. So you have this feedback loop. It's now starting to feed on itself. I don't think Chinese leaders know how to get out of this trap. And clearly they're on a nationalist bender. They shouldn't be if they're concerned about their economy, but clearly they're doing things that are undermining their economy.
So are you saying, let's say, it's a choice between that kind of nationalistic bent, that kind of continued assertiveness in the region and, the health of their economy. Are they going to choose the nationalism over the economy?
They're definitely going to choose nationalism because that's really the primary basis of their legitimacy these days. After Deng Xiaoping, Deng changed the basis of Chinese nationalism from ideology to the continual delivery of prosperity. Chinese leaders know now that they cannot assure continual delivery of prosperity, so the primary basis of legitimacy is nationalism. That means the way for them to stay into power is to play to the nationalistic instincts. And this is a problem because it leads them to do all sorts of things that are, first of all, going to cause conflict with their neighbors and with the United States, but it's also going, as I said, undermine the economy. So right now, they're on a trajectory which is very troubling, and I actually don't see how they get themselves out of it.
All right, Jordan, thank you for joining us to talk about this today, and thanks for watching. For more on this and other issues in China, join us at ntd.tv.